everyone, I'm Sarah Hicks, and welcome to Inside the Conductor Studio and the very first episode of The Art of Conducting. I'm a conductor who has worked in every genre imaginable, from classical symphonic and opera to musicals and films, live and concert. I've worked with artists from every corner of the musical world, done studio work for TV, and even went on tour with a rock star. But everywhere I go, people always ask me, what exactly does a conductor do? And the answer to that question requires more than a short conversation. So years ago, I created a presentation called The Art of Conducting, covering everything from, the history of conducting to score study and how to work with an orchestra. So I've decided to divide up all those topics and devote a video to each one. So here's our first episode, The History of Conducting. When we think of conductors, many of us immediately imagine a white-haired maestro in white tie and tails standing on a podium waving a baton in front of a huge group of instrumentalists, and we assume that this stereotypical conductor has been around forever. But the idea of conducting goes way back, before white ties, before huge orchestras, and even before instrumental ensembles. The history of conducting is very much tied to the history of instrumental music, and the kind of conducting that's familiar to us now didn't really develop until the 19th century. The idea of conducting, however, goes back as far as the 5th century, and it began with vocal church music. This was the earliest form of ensemble music, and it involved a single melody with only a vague rhythmic outline. The early origins of conducting was what's called chironomy, which was a series of choreographed gestures used to indicate both pitch and basic rhythm, and it probably looked nothing like modern conductors' gestures. The leader, or chironomist, wasn't separate from the chorus, but rather a person in the chorus leading from their spot, so there really wasn't a conductor from our modern perspective. Instrumental music of the time rarely exceeded a single instrument, and there really wasn't any notated music for instruments because it was mostly improvised. As choral music progressed into the Renaissance period, musical leadership continued to come from within the ensemble. Because the music was more rhythmic and more complex, by the 15th century, you were likely to see the singer or leader of an ensemble holding a large staff that would be moved up and down to indicate the beat. Alternatively, some choirs were held together rhythmically by one of the members slapping a roll of paper, which sounds like it would be kind of disruptive to me, but hey, I guess it worked. In any case, that was the predecessor to the baton. There were, of course, musical instruments, and they would sometimes play in small ensembles, but again, they had no designated instrumental leader. Instrumental music was considered secondary to choral music, and the music only described the notes to be played and really could be performed with any assortment of instruments. In 1607, the Italian composer Claudio Monteverdi was the first to indicate specifically which instruments would be playing a part, and this was really the beginning of an orchestra as we know it today. Musical notation looks much like modern notation, and we begin to see larger ensembles of instruments, playing both as choral accompaniment and also as purely instrumental music. This era also saw the rise of opera, bringing together voices, instruments, and theater. While this was frequently led by the keyboard player of the orchestra, there would still occasionally be a time beater with a big staff beating out the tempo like in early choral music. The French composer Jean-Baptiste Lully was such an enthusiastic time beater for his operas that during one performance, he smashed his foot with the large wooden staff. He then got gangrene and died, the first and perhaps last fatal conducting injury. Throughout the Baroque period, composers like J.S. Bach wrote more complicated music for instrumental ensembles, but again, these ensembles did not have a conductor, but were rather led by the keyboard player, who was also most likely the composer. Baroque orchestras rarely exceeded 24 players, mostly strings and a few woodwinds, and sometimes brass, all grounded in the keyboard, so you can see how a conductor wouldn't really be necessary. By the classical period, we saw the rise of even more instrumental music, and orchestras had expanded both in scope and instrumentation. Mozart's orchestra would have had a complement of strings, pairs of woodwinds, and a few pairs of brass instruments, as well as a timpani. The decreasing importance of keyboard in the orchestra meant that the ensemble was led most frequently by the principal violinist, using their bow like a baton. Toward the end of the classical era, musical forms and the size of the orchestra had become large enough that sometimes a leader outside of the orchestra was required. Publicity posters from 1791 show that Mozart conducted the premiere of his opera, The Magic Flute. And in 1798, Franz Joseph Haydn reportedly conducted his oratorio, The Creation, with his hands and a baton. Notable here is that while now we have a conductor in front of the orchestra, it's always the composer conducting his own work. By the early 19th century, having a dedicated conductor became the norm. The size of the orchestra expanded even more during this period, with more woodwinds and brass as the technology for those instruments improved. While it was more customary for composers to act as conductors of their own works, we start to see them conducting the works of other composers too. Felix Mendelssohn famously championed the work of Bach, for instance. And some composers of this era attained renown as conductors, including Hector Berlioz and Richard Strauss. The use of the baton became more common, as it was easier to follow than just a conductor's hands or a rolled-up piece of paper. Batons at the time were a bit heftier than they are now and looked more like a miniaturized version of that big staff that killed Lully. Towards the end of this era, Hans von Bülow became better known as a conductor than a composer, and that was really the beginning of conductors as we imagine them today. By the time we reach the 20th century, we see the rise of conductor as not a violinist conductor or a composer conductor, but just a conductor. By this point, the symphony orchestra looked very much as it does now, with winds and brass and percussion along with the strings. Given this large complement of musicians and increasingly complex music, a conductor skilled in the art of conducting itself became necessary. This was the era in which conducting technique as we imagine it now became the norm. Two giants of the conducting world in the early 1900s were the Italian conductor Arturo Toscanini and the German Wilhelm Furtwängler. These guys had wildly different conducting styles. Toscanini used a long baton with large and expressive beats, while Furtwängler used smaller and more constrained gestures. Which is all just to say that even this early on, conducting technique wasn't standardized, but the use of baton was the norm, and the transition to a conductor as leader and figurehead of the orchestra was complete. The mid-20th century saw the standardization of the orchestra as a large ensemble with extended strings, winds, brass, and a percussion complement, and it heralded the arrival of another contrasting pair of conductors, Herbert von Karajan and Leonard Bernstein. The longtime music director of the Berlin Philharmonic, Karajan's technique was very controlled, and he became iconic for conducting with his eyes closed most of the time. Leonard Bernstein, the music director of the New York Philharmonic around the same time, was known for his dramatic gestures and expressive face. Both were household names who made extensive use of the advances in media at the time, from TV to CDs. Moving into the latter part of the 20th century and into this one, we still see a diversity of conducting techniques and styles and even larger orchestras. And as conductors have increasingly become the figureheads of orchestras, many cultivate a distinct brand and image. Seiji Ozawa, Sir Simon Rattle, Valery Gergiev, and Gustavo Dudamel all have their unmistakable styles both on and off the podium, although as a general trend, conducting gestures have tended towards the extremely expressive and dynamic. In the late 20th century is when we finally started seeing prominent female conductors. Maren Alsop was one of the first of what is now more and more women on the podium. In general, in the present day, while the basic techniques of conducting are shared by conductors, individual styles have become very unique and will probably continue to be moving forward. Now that you know a little bit about the history of conducting, you might be wondering, okay, so what do conductors do? And that answer is in two parts. First is score study, and the second is the gestural vocabulary of conductors. In the next video, we'll be delving into score study and all the crazy things that conductors need to know and keep track of. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And also, don't forget to subscribe so you'll know when the next video is available. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you at the next episode of The Art of Conducting.